Rome, the empire of marble, legions and emperors worshipped like gods. But what happens when the mask of divinity slips? What if the men who built the world's greatest empire were also its greatest monsters? Imagine rulers who poisoned their own families, who turned cruelty into entertainment, who demanded to be worshipped as living gods while trembling in fear of shadows in their own halls. These were not just leaders. They were men consumed by obsession, paranoia, and scandal. And tonight we're stepping into their world. Welcome to the darkest secrets of Rome's emperors. Rome, the very name conjures images of grandeur. Legions marching in perfect formation, emperors crowned with laurel wreaths, and marble temples stretching toward the heavens. For centuries, the Roman Empire stood as the most formidable power the world had ever seen, a civilization whose shadow still looms over modern life. But beneath the marble statues, the golden triumphs, and the echoes of victory chants, another Rome existed. A Rome hidden behind palace walls. A Rome where fear was constant, trust was a luxury, and survival often meant striking first. The emperors we remember as gods, as visionaries, as builders of civilization, were often men consumed by their own demons. Picture the imperial palace at night, flickering oil lamps casting shadows across endless corridors, guards whispering nervously as they watch for assassins. Behind one door, a ruler lies awake, convinced that even his closest family is plotting against him. Behind another, a banquet stretches into chaos, goblets of wine flowing, slaves scrambling, and the emperor's laughter masking a heart steeped in paranoia. These were not just leaders. They were men who wielded absolute power, and absolute power comes with a price. The emperors of Rome lived lives both magnificent and monstrous, sculpting their public image with divine precision while hiding private lives filled with cruelty, scandal, and fear. In this story, we're going to pull back the curtain on that world. We'll uncover the carefully crafted facades that emperors used to control their people, the paranoia that poisoned their thrones, and the brutal reality of ruling the greatest empire on earth. You'll hear about emperors who descended into madness, declaring themselves gods, indulging in sadistic pleasures, or turning the empire into their personal playground. You'll learn of betrayals written in poison and blood, of scandals so shocking they were whispered about in every corner of Rome, and you'll discover how, behind the victories and monuments, the cost of empire was paid in suffering, sacrifice, and human lives. But this isn't just a tale of the past. Rome's emperors left behind more than ruins and stories. They left warnings. Their rise and fall, their secrets and sins, still echo in the halls of power today. Because when one person holds the world in their hands, the line between greatness and madness is perilously thin. So, sit back as we step into the shadows of history. This is not the Rome of marble and glory. This is the Rome of fear, of obsession, of secrets too dark for the statues to tell. The emperor's facade, beyond the triumphs. When we think of Roman emperors, the images that come to mind are dazzling. Towering statues carved from flawless marble, triumphal arches rising above the city, etched with victories over distant lands, coins bearing the emperor's profile, proclaiming his divinity and eternal glory. To the people of Rome, and to us, centuries later, the emperor appeared larger than life, almost untouchable. But this was the facade, a carefully crafted mask. Behind it lay fear, betrayal, and often a desperate scramble for survival. A world of masks. The Roman Empire was built on performance. Emperors understood that appearances mattered more than truth. Statues didn't show wrinkles, weakness, or fear. Inscriptions never mentioned failures. Even the triumphal parades, with captured kings and mountains of gold rolling through the streets, were spectacles designed to hide the cracks in Rome's armor. But imagine standing in the Senate, waiting for the emperor to arrive. The doors swing open and he enters, calm, regal, draped in purple. His expression is carved in stone, his voice steady as he addresses his people. Yet what you cannot see is the storm inside his mind. Who among these men might be plotting his downfall? Which of his allies could turn traitor before the day is out? For an emperor, survival depended on keeping up the mask. Weakness invited rebellion. Vulnerability invited assassination. The facade was not optional, it was armor. Tiberius, the emperor who hid on an island. Tiberius, Rome's second emperor. Publicly, he portrayed himself as the stern, dutiful successor to Augustus. His coins showed him as the embodiment of Roman virtue, the steady hand guiding the empire. But behind the mask, Tiberius was a man haunted by fear. Whispers of conspiracy gnawed at him. Senators murmured behind closed doors. Generals grew too popular with their legions, and rivals seemed to emerge from every shadow. The emperor who once led armies across Europe now withdrew into isolation. He abandoned Rome itself, retreating to the island of Capri, a fortress of rock surrounded by the sea. There, hidden from the public eye, rumors spread of depravity. Ancient writers like Suetonius tell lurid tales, secret chambers, grotesque entertainments, twisted indulgences. Whether exaggerated or not, one truth is certain. Tiberius, once the master of the empire, had become a prisoner of his own paranoia. His facade of control could not mask the terror that consumed him. Image makers of power. But emperors were not only victims of paranoia, they were masters of illusion. Every coin minted, every statue raised, every monument built was part of a propaganda machine designed to project perfection. Augustus, the first emperor, perfected this art. He commissioned portraits that showed him eternally youthful, even into old age. To the people of Rome, he was not just a man, he was the eternal father of the empire. His personal life, filled with betrayals and family tragedies, was scrubbed from the public image. The Augustus that history remembers was as much invention as reality. Even later emperors like Hadrian and Trajan used architecture as self-advertisement. Massive forums, temples, and arches shouted their victories in stone. But those victories came at immense human cost, hidden behind the polished marble. Fear in the palace. Behind the facades, the imperial palace was less a home than a battlefield of whispers. A senator's casual glance could be interpreted as treason. A general's popularity could be mistaken for rebellion. Even family ties offered no safety. Emperors routinely executed brothers, nephews, and even their own children to secure the throne. Claudius, often mocked as weak and foolish, turned ruthlessly on those who threatened him. His wife Messalina was executed after her scandalous affairs threatened the dynasty. Later, he was poisoned by another wife, Agrippina, who wanted her son Nero to rule. The palace glittered in public view, but inside its marble halls, the air was thick with fear. Emperors smiled for statues and parades, but behind closed doors they lived like hunted men, never knowing who would strike first. The mask versus the man. This was the paradox of Rome's emperors. Their image was immortal, but their lives were fragile. The statues of Augustus, Trajan, or Marcus Aurelius endure, serene and godlike. But the men themselves lived in constant tension, trapped in roles they could never fully escape. Consider this. In Rome, the average reign of an emperor lasted less than 8 years. Some lasted mere months. The throne of the Caesars was not a seat of security, but a target painted in gold. Every public triumph masked private dread. The facade cracks. And when the facade slipped, when the emperor's vices or fears spilled into public view, the consequences were catastrophic. Nero, who began his reign projecting youth and energy, soon revealed himself as reckless and cruel. His public image unraveled, and the people turned against him. He was forced to flee the city he once ruled, abandoned by even his guards before taking his own life. The facade was everything, but it was fragile. One slip, one betrayal, one failure, and the mask shattered. Beneath it, the emperor was revealed not as a god, but as a frightened man, clawing to hold on to power. So behind the triumphal arches and marble statues, Rome's emperors lived lives of masks and mirrors. They projected divine perfection to their people while hiding fear, betrayal, and ruthless survival tactics. But what happens when the facade is no longer enough? when the mask slips and the true face of absolute power is revealed? In our next chapter, we'll step deeper into the shadows, to the throne itself, where unchecked authority gave birth not only to corruption, but to madness. The shadowed throne, power, corruption, and madness. The throne of Rome was the most coveted seat in the ancient world, a golden chair that promised absolute power. But absolute power has a way of corrupting even the sharpest minds, twisting ambitions into obsessions, and driving reason into madness. The emperors wore their crowns like gods, but many were undone by the very authority they wielded. In Rome, the throne did not simply reveal a man's character, it magnified his darkest impulses. Caligula, the god who lost his mind. Few stories illustrate this descent into madness better than that of Caligula. He began as a beloved figure. The people adored him, seeing in him the promise of a new golden age after the grim rule of Tiberius. Crowds cheered his generosity, senators praised his kindness, and soldiers admired his lineage. He was young, charming, and charismatic. But once he held the throne, something inside him shifted. Power consumed him, reshaping him into something monstrous. Ancient accounts tell us he began to see himself not as a man, but as a god. He ordered temples to be built in his honor. Statues of himself, dressed in divine regalia, were erected across the empire. He even placed his own likeness in the Temple of Jerusalem, a move so shocking it nearly sparked rebellion. Yet his delusions were not the most terrifying part. It was his cruelty. Caligula reveled in sadistic pleasures, turning executions into theater, forcing families to watch the deaths of loved ones, and mocking senators with public humiliations. Perhaps the most infamous tale, he threatened to appoint his favorite horse, Incitatus, as consul. Whether literal or symbolic, the message was clear. Rome's highest office meant nothing compared to his whims. The boy who had been adored as Little Boot became a tyrant who terrified his empire. His reign ended not with glory but with daggers, his own guards turning on him, cutting down the self-proclaimed god in his palace halls. Domitian, the paranoid emperor. Caligula was not alone. Others followed a similar path, rulers who began with promise but fell victim to paranoia and fear. Take Domitian, a man who ruled decades later. In public, he styled himself as Rome's restorer, a champion of order and morality. His statues depicted him as strong, virtuous, and divine. But behind the polished image, Domitian lived in constant dread of assassination. He lined the walls of his palace with polished stone so he could see reflections of anyone approaching from behind. He rarely walked the halls without a dagger hidden under his robes. Friends, advisors, even family. No one was beyond suspicion. And when suspicion struck, Domitian acted ruthlessly. Senators were purged in waves, generals executed, and whispers punished with blood. Rome trembled under his paranoia. But the more he killed, the more isolated he became. His guards feared him, his senate despised him, and even his wife turned against him. Finally, in 96 CE, the very palace he had fortified against assassins became his tomb. Conspirators stabbed him to death in his own chambers. The tools of power, poison, and the dagger. For emperors, the greatest threat did not always come from foreign enemies. It came from their own tables. Poison became a favorite weapon in the imperial court. It was silent, discreet, and terrifying. A cup of wine, a plate of figs, a slice of meat, all could conceal the taste of death. Emperors poisoned rivals, and rivals poisoned emperors. The most infamous poisoner of all was Agrippina the Younger, mother of Nero. She allegedly poisoned her husband, Emperor Claudius, to secure the throne for her son. Claudius, who had survived years of palace intrigue, fell to a dish of mushrooms. The food of the gods, the Romans called it, though for him it was the food of death. But daggers were just as common. In Rome, loyalty was paper thin. Guards sworn to protect could turn assassins in an instant. Emperors lived under constant threat from their own Praetorian Guard. Soldiers who were supposed to shield them, but often decided who lived and who died. Indeed, more emperors were killed by their own men than by foreign enemies. The throne was gilded, but it was never safe. when cruelty becomes entertainment. What made this power so dangerous was that it was unchecked. No senate, no law, no god could restrain an emperor once he took the throne. And unchecked authority often gave birth to cruelty. Take Nero, who found delight not only in ruling, but in destruction. When a fire ravaged Rome in 64 CE, whispers spread that Nero himself had ordered it to clear space for his new palace. Whether true or not, his response horrified the people. Instead of aiding the victims, he staged lavish performances, singing as flames consumed the city. Later, when suspicion fell on him, he shifted blame to a small sect known as Christians, unleashing one of the first great persecutions. Men and women were burned alive, torn apart by wild animals, or nailed to crosses as crowds cheered. For Nero, cruelty became spectacle, a way to deflect suspicion and reinforce fear. This was the danger of the throne. When one man's whim became the law, the suffering of thousands could be dismissed as entertainment. The madness of Commodus. Perhaps no emperor embodied the corruption of power more grotesquely than Commodus, the son of the philosopher king Marcus Aurelius. Rome had hoped for a wise ruler in his image, a man of discipline and reason. Instead, they received a tyrant who fancied himself a gladiator. Commodus strutted into the arena, dressed in armor, declaring himself the reincarnation of Hercules. He fought wild beasts, carefully weakened beforehand, and battled slaves with wooden swords disguised as steel. The outcomes were staged, but the emperor basked in the cheers, convinced of his own greatness. He renamed Rome itself after his own name, Colonia Commodiana, and demanded that months of the calendar bear his titles. His obsession with self-glorification drained the treasury, humiliated the empire, and horrified the Senate. Finally, in a grim echo of many before him, Commodus was strangled in his bath, murdered by his own servants. The throne as a curse. For Rome's emperors, the throne was both the ultimate prize and the ultimate curse. It promised absolute power, but it delivered paranoia, isolation, and often madness. Caligula's delusions, Domitian's paranoia, Nero's cruelty, Commodus's vanity, these were not accidents. They were symptoms of a system where one man ruled without restraint. And so the throne of Rome became less a seat of honor than a shadowed cage, gilded on the outside, but suffocating within. But power corrupted more than just the men who held it. It corrupted the very empire itself. To sustain their grandeur, emperors demanded endless wars, rivers of gold and oceans of blood. And the cost of their ambition was carried not by them, but by the millions who lived and died under their rule. In our next chapter, we uncover the hidden costs of empire: blood, gold, and sacrifice. The hidden costs of empire: blood, gold, and sacrifice. For all their grandeur, Rome's emperors did not rule in a vacuum. Their ambitions stretched far beyond the palace gates, across provinces, seas, and continents. Their triumphs were paraded as glory, their victories immortalized in marble. But behind those victories lay rivers of blood, mountains of debt, and the silent suffering of millions. Rome's emperors loved to speak of Pax Romana, the Roman peace. To the common citizen, it sounded like harmony. But make no mistake, this peace was built not on diplomacy, but on war, slavery, and fear. Endless wars, endless blood. Rome's empire was forged with the sword. Generals like Caesar and Trajan expanded its borders with ruthless campaigns. Emperors, desperate for prestige, sought victories to legitimize their rule. But each victory came with staggering costs. Entire peoples were wiped out. Towns and villages were razed to the ground. Survivors were chained, marched across continents, and sold in Roman markets as slaves. Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul, celebrated in triumphs and etched into history, cost an estimated 1 million lives. Hundreds of thousands more were enslaved. To Caesar, it was glory. To the Gauls, it was annihilation. Trajan's conquest of Dacia, immortalized on his column in Rome, was another spectacle of death. The carvings showed disciplined legions, towering forts, and the emperor's leadership. What they do not show are the corpses in the mud, the villages burned, or the families torn apart. For emperors, victory was political currency. For soldiers and subjects, it was suffering. Slavery, the engine of empire. The wars fed another beast, slavery. Rome's grandeur was built on the backs of the enslaved. Every conquest brought tens of thousands of captives. They mined the gold that filled imperial treasuries. They built the roads and aqueducts that bound the empire together. They entertained the crowds in blood-soaked arenas, fighting to the death for the amusement of emperors and citizens alike. Slaves were so abundant that in some regions they outnumbered the free population, and their suffering was unimaginable. The mines of Spain and Dacia were death sentences. The fields of Sicily and North Africa broke bodies under relentless sun. The gladiatorial schools trained men to die for spectacle. Emperors may have gloried in the titles of Father of the Nation or Restorer of Peace, but their power was sustained by chains, lashes, and oppression. The cost of luxury. The emperors themselves lived in unimaginable luxury, but it came at a crippling cost to the empire. Banquets were notorious. Tables groaned under exotic dishes, peacock tongues, flamingo brains, lamprey eels bathed in honey. The wines were vintage, poured until guests collapsed in stupor. Meanwhile, the people of Rome often struggled with grain shortages. Nero drained the treasury building his Domus Aurea, or Golden House, a sprawling palace with rotating dining rooms, lakes, and gilded ceilings. It glittered with opulence, while citizens who lost their homes in the Great Fire begged for shelter. Caligula's extravagance was so wild that he once ordered ships to line up across the Bay of Naples, building a floating bridge just so he could ride his horse across the sea in a display of godlike power. The cost was staggering. The purpose? Pure vanity. Each indulgence meant higher taxes, harsher levies, and deeper debt. When the treasury ran dry, emperors debased the currency, mixing base metals into silver coins, sparking inflation that eroded the livelihoods of ordinary Romans, suppressing dissent with blood. And when the burden grew too great, when unrest stirred among the people, the emperors responded not with mercy, but with iron. Rebellions in the provinces were crushed with brutality. The Jewish revolt under Nero and later under Vespasian and Titus ended with Jerusalem in flames, its temple destroyed, and tens of thousands killed or enslaved. Closer to Rome, dissent was met with terror. Senators who opposed emperors often found themselves accused of treason, stripped of property, or executed in staged trials. Citizens who rioted over food shortages were slaughtered by troops in the streets. Even entertainment became a tool of control. The Colosseum and Circus Maximus served as pressure valves, offering free bread and games to distract the masses. Gladiators fought. Exotic beasts were slaughtered. Criminals died gruesome deaths. The message was clear. Rome could give spectacle, but it could also take life. The empire's fragile economy. For all its power, the empire was fragile beneath the surface. Wars brought plunder, but also costs. Legions had to be fed, armed, and paid. Luxury projects bankrupted the treasury. Inflation weakened trade, and the people knew it. Discontent simmered. Grain shortages sparked riots. Heavy taxation bred resentment. Provinces rebelled under the weight of imperial greed. The emperors sat atop golden thrones, but the foundation beneath them was cracking. And when the people rose up, the emperors answered with brutality, widening the gulf between ruler and ruled. Glory built on sacrifice. This was the hidden truth of Rome's grandeur. Every marble column, every glittering banquet, every triumphal parade was paid for in blood. The blood of soldiers who marched endlessly to fight wars of ambition. The blood of slaves who built and toiled in silence. The blood of citizens crushed under the weight of taxation and repression. The empire's facade of peace and prosperity concealed a reality of suffering and sacrifice. And while the emperors basked in their glory, the costs were borne by everyone else. So when we admire the grandeur of Rome, the Colosseum, the aqueducts, the triumphal arches, we must remember the price that was paid. Rome's emperors may have ruled the greatest empire of their age, but their ambition demanded rivers of blood, oceans of gold, and endless sacrifice. And if their public triumphs masked hidden costs, their private lives concealed even darker truths. In our next chapter, we pull back the curtain on the emperors themselves, their scandals, their obsessions, and the personal demons that would shape their legacies for centuries. The personal demons: scandal, depravity, and legacy. If the throne of Rome was a stage, the emperors were its star actors, dazzling the public with masks of divinity and power. But behind the velvet curtains of the palace, away from the adoring crowds, another play unfolded. It was darker, twisted, and often unspeakable. The private lives of Rome's emperors were riddled with scandals, obsessions, and acts so shocking that ancient historians often wrote them in whispers, half afraid readers would refuse to believe them. And yet these personal demons shaped their reigns just as much as wars, laws, or monuments. Nero, the emperor who killed his own blood. Few emperors embodied scandal and depravity like Nero. At first, he was the golden boy of Rome, young, charming, promising an age of renewal. But his reign soon spiraled into a nightmare of excess and cruelty. His greatest enemy was not a senator or a rival general. It was his own mother. Agrippina the Younger had schemed for years to place Nero on the throne, even poisoning her husband, Emperor Claudius, to secure his succession. But once Nero became emperor, her influence loomed too large. The young ruler, urged by his advisors, began plotting her death. At first, he tried subtlety. He invited her onto a boat designed to collapse at sea, but Agrippina swam to shore, dripping wet yet very much alive. Nero panicked. Soon after, he sent assassins to her villa. They cut her down in her bedchamber, leaving the mother who had birthed an emperor sprawled in blood. And Nero, he justified the murder as an act of state security. In truth, it was the act of a son so consumed by power that he saw even his own mother as a threat. But Nero's darkness did not stop there. He beat his pregnant wife Poppaea to death in a fit of rage. Later, longing for her presence, he found a boy named Sporus who resembled her. Nero had the boy castrated and paraded him as his bride. In the emperor's private life, cruelty mingled with obsession, leaving scars not only on his victims, but on Rome itself. Commodus, the emperor of indulgence. Then there was Commodus, whose reign turned the empire into his personal playground. By day he sat on the throne. By night he descended into orgies of excess. Ancient accounts describe endless banquets where he drank himself into oblivion, surrounded by slaves, concubines, and entertainers. But his true obsession was more bizarre. Commodus fancied himself a gladiator. He strutted into the Colosseum dressed as Hercules, wielding a club, demanding the adoration of the crowd. His opponents were slaves and wild animals, carefully arranged to ensure his victories. Yet he presented these staged combats as proof of his divine strength. Imagine it, the emperor of the world's greatest empire, fighting crippled men in the arena, bellowing like a god while the Senate cringed in humiliation. Commodus even renamed Rome after himself, declaring it the colony of Commodus. For him, the empire was not a realm to govern, but a toy to amuse his vanity. Elagabalus, Rome's most scandalous ruler. But perhaps no emperor shocked Rome's moral sensibilities more than Elagabalus. Barely a teenager when he took the throne, Elagabalus scandalized his subjects with behavior that defied every Roman norm. He married not once, not twice, but 5 times, including a union with a Vestal virgin, a sacrilege so outrageous that it horrified the empire. He paraded through the city in women's clothing, insisted on being called empress, and surrounded himself with dancers and eunuchs. He introduced bizarre religious rituals from his native Syria, forcing Rome to worship his god, Elagabalus. But it was his private feasts that became infamous. Guests were smothered with rose petals dropped from hidden ceilings. Dishes were laced with strange ingredients. And according to lurid rumors, he offered enormous rewards to any doctor who could surgically transform him into a woman. To conservative Romans, this was not just scandal, it was sacrilege. Elagabalus was eventually murdered by his own Praetorian Guard, his body dragged through the streets, his memory condemned. Incest, betrayal, and family feuds. If Rome's emperors were haunted by enemies, their greatest threats often came from within their own families. Dynasties built on blood were just as often destroyed by it. Brothers turned on brothers, sons against fathers, mothers against sons. Caracalla, co-emperor with his brother Geta, grew so paranoid of sharing power that he had Geta murdered in their mother's arms. Thousands of his brother's supporters were executed in a bloody purge. Incestuous whispers followed the Julius Claudian line. Rumors swirled around Caligula and his sisters. Nero's relationship with his mother was described as disturbingly intimate before it turned murderous. In the imperial palace, the line between family bond and political calculation blurred until it all dissolved in betrayal. The palace as a theater of madness. Behind the palace gates, Rome's rulers lived in a world detached from reality. Their wealth was unimaginable. Golden ceilings, pools filled with wine, banquets where flamingo tongues and peacock brains were served as delicacies. But indulgence bred isolation. Surrounded by flatterers, stripped of normal human limits, emperors fell into obsessions. Some became sadists, others became paranoiacs. Still others lost themselves in spectacles of self-worship. And Rome watched, horrified yet captivated. Senators whispered, citizens gossiped, historians scribbled stories of scandal that still shock us today. How scandal shapes legacy. Yet for all their power, the emperors could not escape judgment. Their legacies were defined not only by their wars and monuments, but by their personal demons. Nero is remembered less for his policies than for his cruelty and excess. Commodus is a symbol of decline, the emperor who turned the Colosseum into his playground. Elagabalus remains infamous as the embodiment of scandal. Their private lives became public history, staining their names forever. Because in Rome, even emperors could not control the story told about them after death. And so we see the emperors not as gods carved in marble, but as men consumed by obsession, scandal, and depravity. Their sins shaped their legacies as surely as their victories. But what do these tales mean for us today? Why do their darkest secrets still captivate us 2,000 years later? In our final chapter, we step beyond Rome, to the lessons these emperors leave for every age, and the echoes of power, corruption, and obsession that still surround us. Echoes through time, lessons from the imperial underbelly. The marble ruins of Rome stand silent now, the palaces where emperors plotted, the arenas where crowds roared, the villas where scandal unfolded, all are reduced to fragments of stone and whispers carried on the wind. But if you listen closely, you can still hear the echoes. For the emperors of Rome did not simply live and die. They left behind warnings, reminders of what happens when power, unchecked and unchallenged, consumes those who hold it. Power as a double-edged sword. Absolute power gave Rome its glory. It built aqueducts that still stand, roads that cut across continents, and monuments that defy time itself. But absolute power also bred paranoia, cruelty, and excess. Caligula, Nero, Domitian, Commodus. Their stories are more than tales of madness. They reveal a truth about human nature. When no one dares say no, when fear replaces accountability, even the strongest minds can unravel. And Rome was not alone. Across history, we see the same pattern. Kings, sultans, dictators, men who began with vision, only to lose themselves in the shadows of their own authority. The cycle repeats again and again. The cost paid by the many. The emperors lived in palaces of gold, but the cost was carried by millions of ordinary people. Soldiers marched endlessly to satisfy imperial ambition. Farmers paid crushing taxes to fund games and monuments. Slaves built the very wonders we still marvel at today. The emperor's scandals may shock us, but their excess was always paid for in blood, sweat, and sacrifice. Rome's grandeur was not free, it was bought with human lives. And here lies another echo. Whenever leaders pursue glory without restraint, it is rarely they who pay the price. It is the people. The temptation of the facade. Perhaps the most striking lesson is the power of image. Rome's emperors mastered propaganda long before modern politics. Statues portrayed them as gods. Coins spread their faces across the empire. Victories were carved into arches, failures erased from memory. But beneath the facade, they were often broken men, terrified, insecure, consumed by vice. 2,000 years later, the methods have changed, but the temptation remains the same. Leaders still polish images, hide flaws, and sell myths to their people. The facade may be digital instead of marble, but the principle is the same. Appearance is weapon, image is survival. Rome reminds us to look beyond the facade, to question the polished image and ask what lies beneath. The cycle of power and corruption. History has a rhythm, and Rome plays its chorus again and again. Power concentrates, leaders rise, corruption follows, the people suffer. Eventually the facade cracks, and the cycle begins anew. Domitian's paranoia, Nero's cruelty, Commodus's vanity. These were not isolated tragedies. They were symptoms of a deeper truth. Unchecked authority breeds its own destruction. Rome may have fallen, but its lessons remain etched in history. When we see rulers silencing dissent, glorifying themselves, or indulging in excess while their people suffer, we should remember the emperors. We should remember how quickly glory can turn to ruin. Why the dark side fascinates us. But perhaps the most revealing echo lies within us. Why do we remain so captivated by the emperor's darkest secrets? Why do we read about Nero's crimes, Caligula's madness, or Elagabalus' scandals with such morbid fascination? The answer is that their stories are mirrors. They reflect not just the flaws of a few men, but the flaws that lurk in all of us. Ambition, pride, desire, fear. These are not Roman traits. They are human traits. When we look at the emperors, we are not just peering into the past. We are peering into ourselves and into the fragile line between order and chaos, greatness and destruction. A whisper from the past. So the ruins of Rome whisper still. They remind us that power is intoxicating, but dangerous, that facades can hide rot, that corruption is not an accident, but a consequence of unchecked rule. They remind us that the emperors were not gods, nor demons, but men who could not master their own appetites, men whose personal demons shaped the fate of millions. And they remind us that history does not only repeat itself, it warns us, if we listen. So the next time you walk past the crumbling arches of Rome or gaze at the marble bust of an emperor in a museum, remember, behind that calm face was a storm. Behind that polished stone were scandals, betrayals, obsessions, and crimes too dark for official histories to tell. And perhaps the true legacy of the emperors is not their victories or monuments, but their cautionary tales. Because in their shadows, we see the truth. Power reveals, power corrupts, and power, unchecked, destroys. This has been the Roman emperor's darkest secrets.